The interrogation room smelled like bleach and old rage. Caleb Cross sat cuffed to a steel table, wrists burning, beard damp with sweat, as the fluorescent light stuttered overhead. Officer Ryler reached up, slapped his cap over the security camera, and killed the breaker. Red light gone. "Off the record," he whispered, baton snapping open with a metallic hiss. From the back kennels, a desperate bark punched through the cinder block. Liberty. Her collar jingled once, then went silent, like someone had grabbed her throat. Ryler raised the baton. "I break your hand, then I put your mutt down." Caleb's jaw tightened. In his mind, a timer ticked toward 0. If he didn't check in soon, the dead man switch would scream to the feds, or die with him. Before we find out how Caleb reached this breaking point, please subscribe and hit the bell to support our veterans. Oak Haven woke beneath a ceiling of wet heat. Even before sunrise cleared the live oaks, the air clung to skin and turned every breath into work. Caleb Cross parked his dusty pickup at the edge of the diner lot and kept both hands on the wheel while the engine ticked. He was broad-shouldered and compactly muscled, beard trimmed short, a thin silver scar cutting from his left temple into the darker stubble. People looked right past scars like that in small towns, until the wrong moment. Liberty lifted her head from the passenger seat and studied him with steady amber eyes. She was a female golden retriever, full-grown and athletic, coat the color of warm honey with faint cream along her muzzle. She didn't whine or paw. She simply leaned her shoulder against his arm, anchoring him to the present the way she'd done since the first night he woke choking on a dream. Caleb exhaled slowly. "All right, girl," he murmured. "Eggs, coffee, then we roll." Her tail tapped once. Quiet consent. The bell above the diner door jingled as they stepped inside. Air conditioning rattled and washed cool over Caleb's face, carrying bacon grease, burnt toast, and lemon floor wax. An old-time smell that felt like safety and made him suspicious for feeling it. He chose a corner booth with his back to the wall, eyes taking in exits, windows, and hands. Liberty slid under the table and curled at his boots, chin near his toe, breathing steady. His left knee bounced once, an old habit. A siren outside turned in his mind into incoming rounds. Liberty shifted, pressed her cheek to his boot, and the battlefield faded. Her service vest read, "Do not pet." Simple armor for them both. A waitress approached with that practiced shuffle of decades. Mabel's hair was pinned neat and silver, her apron clean, her smile tired but real. "Morning, honey," she said, voice raspy with kindness. "Water for your pretty girl?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb replied, low and polite. Mabel set a collapsible bowl on the floor and poured ice water. Liberty drank without spilling, then sat again, posture calm, ears alert. Mabel chuckled. "Better manners than half the men in this town." Caleb's mouth twitched. "We try." He ordered steak and eggs, medium rare, and took the first sip of coffee like a ritual. For a handful of minutes, the diner sounded normal, plates clinking, soft talk, a radio murmuring weather. Caleb's shoulders loosened. The buzzing behind his ribs, old adrenaline that never fully left, quieted. Then the front door swung open hard enough to make the bell scream. 3 uniformed officers entered as if they owned the building, bringing humid air and the sharp smell of sun-baked polyester. The leader was thick-necked and flushed, his badge gleaming like it had never known honest work. His eyes swept the room looking for a target, not a crime. Caleb didn't know his name yet, but he knew the breed. A bully with paperwork. The man's gaze caught the golden curve of Liberty's tail beneath the table. A bored grin hooked his mouth. He carried a large takeout cup of coffee, lid sitting loose. He walked down the aisle, boots heavy, shoulder-brushing booths on purpose. At Caleb's table, he feigned a stumble. The cup tipped. Dark, scalding coffee splashed across the tile, close enough that Liberty jerked her paws back. The flinch was fast and silent, training, strangling instinct, but Caleb saw it, and something inside him went cold. The diner fell into a dead hush. "Oops," the officer said, looking down with fake surprise. "Didn't see the mutt." His eyes lifted to Caleb's, daring him. "You shouldn't bring dangerous animals around decent folks trying to eat." Caleb's hand slid under the table and rested on Liberty's neck. Her muscles trembled once, then steadied under his touch. He met the officer's stare with flat calm, the kind that had quieted rooms full of armed men overseas. "She's under the table," he said evenly. "Not in your way." The grin faltered, just a crack, then returned harder. "Watch your tone. I'm the law in Oak Haven." Caleb didn't blink. He noted the badge number and filed it away like coordinates. "Clean it up," the officer ordered, and strutted off, laughing with his 2 followers. Caleb knelt, blotted the coffee with napkins, and checked Liberty's paws. Her pads were pink but unburned. Still, she kept them tucked close, watching. When he slid back into the booth, an elderly man at the next table leaned slightly toward him. He wore a faded veteran cap, hands shaking with age, eyes sharp as nails. "You showed restraint," the old man whispered. "Most men would have swung." "Swinging's easy," Caleb murmured. "Costs too much." The man nodded. "Arthur," he said, "that one's Ryler, mayor's boy, chief's nephew, judge's godson. Folks here keep their heads down." Caleb watched Ryler's crew claim a booth and eat like it was their right. They didn't ask for a check. They didn't lower their voices. The whole room pretended not to notice, because noticing got you hurt. At the counter, Mabel's elbow bumped a basket of silverware. A fork clanged to the floor, small, harmless. Ryler froze as if the sound offended him personally. He stepped into Mabel's space, looming over her. "Getting sloppy," he said softly, which was worse than yelling. "Oh, sanitation's serious. I could call the inspector, shut you down. How you gonna pay rent? Buy your medicine?" Mabel's fingers trembled as she reached for the fork. "I'm sorry, Hank," she whispered. Caleb felt the old pressure rise behind his eyes, the urge to act, to fix, to end the threat. He tasted metal on his tongue, a flashback reflex. Under the table, Liberty nudged his boot, gentle as a hand on a shoulder. Her empathy was wordless, patient. "Breathe, not yet." Ryler smiled, satisfied with the fear he'd planted. "Next time I won't be forgiving," he murmured, then walked out. The bell jingled cheerfully behind him, an innocent sound that didn't match what he'd left in the room. Silence lingered like smoke. Arthur sank back, shaking worse. Mabel blinked hard and tried to smile at customers who wouldn't meet her gaze. Caleb placed cash on the table and stood. Liberty rose with him, close at heel, her coat catching the diner light like polished gold. Mabel hurried over, voice tight. "Honey, please, don't make trouble. He'll ruin you." Caleb looked at her, really looked. He saw the lines of exhaustion, the pride, the quiet courage of a woman who'd survived every decade by serving coffee and swallowing insults. "Ma'am," he said gently, "trouble's already here." Outside, heat wrapped around them again. Liberty sniffed, then stiffened, her ears angled toward the far end of the lot. A patrol car sat half hidden behind a delivery truck, engine running, windows dark. Caleb's pulse didn't spike. It settled into a steadier, colder rhythm, the mission rhythm he hated and couldn't forget. He opened his door, slid in, and Liberty hopped up beside him, eyes still fixed on the cruiser. Caleb pulled out. After 2 seconds, the patrol car eased forward too, keeping distance, keeping pace. Oak Haven had taken notice, and it wasn't done watching. Oak Haven had taken notice, and it wasn't done watching. Caleb Cross drove out of the diner lot with the same patience he used to save for hostile streets overseas. Steady speed, no sudden turns, no invitation. In the rearview mirror, a patrol cruiser floated behind him like a stubborn shadow, never close enough to justify a stop, never far enough to be accidental. Caleb's beard hid the tight line of his jaw, but not the pale scar that split his left temple and vanished into his hair. Scars didn't scare bullies. They only made them curious about what kind of violence had carved a man that quiet. Liberty sat tall in the passenger seat, service vest snug over her golden coat. Her fur was the color of warm honey, darker along her back where rainwater still clung from the morning humidity. She watched the cruiser with amber, unblinking focus, then glanced at Caleb as if asking a simple question. "Are we running or are we working?" Caleb answered by resting 2 fingers on the wheel, one of their private signals. Not running, assessing. He turned onto a 2-lane road lined with pines and sagging Spanish moss, then took a dirt cutoff toward the outskirts. The cruiser followed. Caleb waited until the road narrowed between trees, then eased into a public campground entrance. At the last second, he swung into the loop behind a line of RVs and killed his lights. The cruiser rolled past the gate, hesitated, then continued. No siren, no spotlight, just a predator deciding whether the chase was worth the paperwork. Only when the taillights vanished did Caleb let his lungs release. Liberty pressed her shoulder against his forearm, steady heat through the fabric. The touch pulled him back from the old reflex, an invisible snap in his chest that wanted to turn every shadow into an ambush. "Good girl," he murmured, rough voice low. "We're not prey." He chose a campsite deeper in the pines where the air smelled of resin and wet earth. His setup looked like any traveler's: tarp, small stove, folding table, but every detail was angled for escape. Truck nose out, gear within reach, clear lanes of sight. When dusk fell, the woods grew too quiet. Silence like that used to mean someone was walking mortars closer. Caleb forced his breath into squares, 4 in, hold, 4 out, until the pressure behind his eyes eased. Grooming Liberty was the next part of the ritual. He brushed her coat in long strokes, checking for burrs and ticks, inspecting each paw pad for cuts. Liberty stayed still, trusting him completely. That trust was his anchor. He could live without sleep, without comfort, without forgiveness. He could not live without her calm certainty that the present was safe. From the lockbox bolted behind the seat, Caleb pulled out a tactical harness, matte black straps, reinforced stitching, designed for working dogs. He fitted it snug across Liberty's chest, then clicked a micro camera into the mount, no bigger than a matchbox. A transmitter and battery pack slid into a pouch. The antenna lay flat under the fabric like a hidden spine. Liberty's posture changed the moment the buckles snapped, her tail lowered, her ears sharpened, work mode. Caleb scratched behind her ear, feeling the soft fur give way to muscle. "Job time," he said. She nudged his hand once, then held still, waiting. For the next 2 days, they learned Oak Haven's rhythm. Caleb watched from the edges, parked beside a laundromat, sitting on a bench near the courthouse, lingering at a gas station with a bottle of water he never opened. Officer Hank Ryler's cruiser appeared everywhere that fear lived, behind shops, outside the diner, beside tourists who didn't know the rules. Ryler rarely hunted alone. One deputy was wiry and twitchy, eyes darting like a ferret's. Sneed. The other was a shaved-headed wall of muscle named Vance, slow to speak, quick to obey, hands always hovering near his belt. Together, they moved like a pack that had never once been told no. On the second evening, the wet heat finally broke into drizzle. Asphalt shone under yellow streetlights. Caleb parked a block from a dim industrial park and set his tablet on the passenger seat, screen dimmed. "Go," he whispered. Liberty slipped through a gap in a fence, low and silent, her paws finding dry patches as if she'd been born for shadows. The camera feed wobbled once, then steadied. Weeds, chain link, the blunt shape of Ryler's cruiser idling beside a beat-up sedan with out-of-state plates. A middle-aged man stood outside the sedan, rain flattening his hair. His hands shook as he held out a wallet. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. A tourist. Easy money? Ryler leaned out the window, dashboard light carving his face into smug angles. He spoke in a slow, practiced tone, the voice of a man selling inevitability. The tourist fumbled bills free and handed over a thick wad of cash. Ryler snatched it, grinned, and waved him off. The sedan sped away, taillights smearing red through the rain. Caleb saved the clip, encrypted it, and backed it up twice. Proof of extortion. Useful, but not enough to break a dynasty. 10 minutes later, a rusted tow truck rattled into the lot. A thin man hopped down in a grease-stained jumpsuit, skin the color of old parchment. He moved with nervous energy, glancing around like a rat near a trap. Liberty's camera caught his face in a quick tilt of light. Caleb remembered Arthur's whisper from the diner. Lenny, the town's fence. Lenny approached the cruiser differently than the tourist had. No fear, just business. He spoke fast about stripped parts and crates ready for shipment. Ryler lit a cigarette, match flare reflecting in his small, hungry eyes. "My cut?" he asked. Lenny slid a thick envelope through the window. Ryler weighed it in his hand, satisfied, and warned him to keep things quiet. Caleb felt a cold knot form beneath his ribs. Bribes, stolen vehicles, a pipeline. Oak Haven wasn't sick with one bad cop. It was infected. He whispered, "Recall?" Liberty backed away, melting into weeds. Halfway out, she stopped and stared into darkness beyond the fence, head slightly tilted. Something was there. Soundless, unseen. Then she moved again, returning to Caleb's truck with rain dripping off her whiskers. Caleb unclipped the harness and toweled her dry. "You just lit the fuse," he said, voice rough with pride and grief tangled together. Liberty leaned her head against his thigh, a steady pressure that said, "I'm here. Keep going." He slept in fragments that night, waking at every crackle of branch. Near dawn, fog curled low between trunks. Liberty rose first, body angled toward the trees, lips barely parted. Not barking, warning. Caleb slid out of the truck, boots silent on damp needles. He circled to the passenger side and froze. Pine needles had been disturbed in a crescent near the door. A faint smear of mud crossed the rocker panel. Beside the rear tire, in soft ground, sat a fresh boot print. Deep tread, wide heel, made within hours. Someone had found his base, and they weren't alone either. Liberty's low growl vibrated in her chest as she stared into the fog, and somewhere beyond the pines, a twig snapped. Liberty's low growl vibrated through her ribs as she stared into the fog, and somewhere beyond the pines, a twig snapped. Caleb didn't move fast. He moved quiet. His beard hid the tight line of his mouth, but the pale scar at his temple caught the weak dawn like a blade. He slid his hand down Liberty's neck and lifted 2 fingers. Hold. She froze, muscles coiled, amber eyes wide, reading him the way she read storms. Another snap. Closer. Not a deer. The rhythm was too measured. Caleb eased to the truck, staying inside the shadow line, and listened. He forced his pulse low. Don't give them the excitement they came for. He opened the cab without letting the door click. Everything was packed for flight, because he never truly unpacked anymore. Liberty hopped in and stared through the windshield, ears angled forward. Her damp golden coat smelled like clean grass, and it steadied him more than any therapist's office ever had. Caleb started the engine and rolled out, slow, letting the tires whisper over pine needles. In the mirror, fog shifted between trunks. A shape moved, then stopped. Someone had been close enough to touch the truck, close enough to hurt Liberty. He swallowed the thought before it could bloom into panic. 2 miles down the dirt track, he pulled into a turnout and killed the engine. He crouched and swept a small flashlight under the frame, searching for a beacon, a magnet box, anything that didn't belong. Nothing obvious. That only meant the person trailing him was either careful or confident. Liberty pressed her nose to the ground, tracing scent back toward the pines. Her tail lifted, stiff. Caleb understood. 2 men, heavy boots, cheap cologne, one with tobacco on his breath. She looked up at him with a plea that didn't need words. Don't let them take me. I won't, he murmured, and the promise tasted like iron. By mid-morning, Oak Haven looked ordinary again. That was the trick of rot. It hid inside routine. Caleb parked behind a grocery store and replayed his clips. Ryler taking cash, Ryler taking envelopes. Damning wasn't enough. He needed the files out of his hands. He'd noticed a storefront on Main Street. Web and print, red letters peeling, public Wi-Fi, cameras. It sat 3 blocks from the station, danger and cover. In Oak Haven, people were trained to look away. Caleb slid a micro SD into a waterproof sleeve and knelt beside Liberty. He unbuckled her collar beneath the service vest and stitched the sleeve into the inside seam with needle and thread from his kit. His hands didn't shake. Overseas, they had done worse. Here, with Liberty's warm breath on his wrist, every stitch felt like a prayer. "Insurance," he whispered. Liberty licked his knuckles, soft, forgiving, and pressed her head into his palm. Her empathy was a quiet weight that kept him in the present. They walked into town just after noon. Caleb kept his posture loose, cap low. Liberty stayed tight at heel, vest visible, calm enough to make strangers relax while Caleb measured every reflection in every window. Web and print was nearly empty. 2 teenagers gamed with headphones. A thin woman behind the counter chewed gum. Her tag read, Sandy. Her eyes flicked to Liberty, then to Caleb, then away. "Need a station?" she asked, bored but watchful. "Quick upload," Caleb said. "And maybe a print job." $5 an hour, Sandy replied, sliding a laminated card across. She looked like someone who'd learned not to ask questions in Oak Haven. Caleb chose a computer with its screen facing a wall mirror. He sat where he could see the door without turning. Liberty settled under the desk, her flank pressed against his boot. Her breathing slowed his. He plugged in a drive, opened the encrypted folder, and began the upload in small, disguised chunks to a dead-drop server. If the full package completed, it would forward automatically and erase his trail. The progress bar crawled. A gust of humid air pushed through the front door. Liberty's head lifted. Caleb didn't look up. He listened for boots. 2 men entered, jeans, tucked shirts, cheap belts. One had a flat top and a neck too thick for his collar. The other was lean, twitchy, ferret-eyed. His gaze snagged on Liberty, then on Caleb, and his mouth curled like he'd spotted prey. He spoke quietly to Sandy. Sandy's face went a shade paler. She glanced toward Caleb, then away, like she'd just been reminded who ran this town. The bar hit 60%. Caleb kept breathing slow. Leaving now would waste the risk he'd already taken. He opened a second upload window. Outside, a vehicle door slammed, then another. Liberty's ears pinned back. Her tail thumped once against the carpet. Warning, not fear. Caleb felt the net tightening, familiar as a memory. The lights flickered. The upload stuttered. Sandy's phone rang. She answered, listened, then reached under the counter. The overhead lights died. Weak backup bulbs glowed yellow. Caleb yanked the drive free and rose. "Liberty!" he whispered. She stood, tight to his leg. He moved toward the back door beside the copy machines. A hard arm hooked his shoulder and slammed him into the printer table. Pain flashed white. His cap flew. The thick-necked man pinned him, breath sour with beer. "Thought you were gonna run, stranger?" he muttered. Caleb's body answered before his mind could spiral into the dark. He dropped weight, twisted, and broke the hold with a sharp elbow. He didn't strike to punish, he struck to escape. The man stumbled, cursing. The ferret-eyed one lunged. Caleb saw the glint of a knife, small, fast, meant for ribs. Liberty erupted with a bark that rattled the room, not wild but commanding. She snapped close to the knife hand, forcing distance without biting. Caleb caught the wrist and wrenched. The knife clattered. Then something heavy cracked into his forearm. Baton, wrench, whatever was at hand. Hot pain shot to his shoulder. His vision narrowed. He tasted copper and old fear. He forced it down. "Out!" he rasped. Liberty bolted for the alley. Caleb followed, favoring his arm, boots slipping on wet gravel as they burst into sunlight. He hit the wall, breathing hard. A van rolled in from the street. No plates, side door sliding open. 2 more men jumped out. Too many, too tight. Caleb reached for Liberty, but she darted left, trying to draw them away the way she always did when she sensed weakness in him. "Liberty!" Caleb shouted, and the sound tore his throat raw. A loop of cable snapped around Liberty's neck and jerked her off her feet. She yelped, one sharp, broken sound that punched straight into Caleb's chest. He lunged, but the thick-necked man slammed into him. Gravel bit his palms. His injured forearm screamed. In the chaos, Liberty's golden body vanished into the van, tail flashing once like a flag going under. The door slammed. The van peeled away. Caleb pushed up, shaking, rain sweat mixing on his skin. His phone buzzed again. A new message lit the screen, simple and cold. "Come alone." The words glowed on Caleb Cross's phone, like a command carved into bone. Sweat ran down his scarred temple into the short beard that hid the tremor in his jaw. His left forearm throbbed where something blunt had kissed it, pain that tried to pull him back into other rooms, other hands. He forced the flashback down, breathed once, and looked to the empty passenger seat where Liberty should have been. The silence there was louder than any siren. He wrapped his arm with gauze from the truck kit, tight enough to steady. Then he drove. Oak Haven's main street was already waking into Sunday bustle. Church dresses, pickup trucks, fathers with coffee cups, old women moving carefully in heat that hadn't yet turned cruel. Caleb parked 2 blocks away and walked, shoulders loose, eyes hard. He kept his cap low, but the scar at his temple still caught sunlight, a pale seam that whispered he'd survived what others hadn't. At the diner, the bell jingled. Conversation thinned the moment he stepped inside alone. Mabel stood behind the counter, hands mid-wipe, her smile collapsing into worry. "Honey, where's your girl?" she whispered. Caleb didn't answer. He scanned the room. The window booth by the bay glass. The throne table, empty. Kept empty by fear. He chose it anyway, pulled out the chair, and sat as if he owned the air. The scrape of wood on tiles sounded like a challenge. Arthur was there, hunched at a smaller booth with 2 other veterans, paper hands trembling around a mug. His cataract-clouded eyes sharpened on Caleb. "You're alone," he rasped. "For now," Caleb said. He placed his phone face down, as if to keep the message from spreading poison. "I need him to come here." Arthur's lips tightened. "Ryler?" Caleb nodded. "He wants theater. I'm giving him a stage." Mabel brought coffee without being asked, then slipped a plate of biscuits down like contraband. Her fingers shook. "Please," she breathed. "Don't do this." Caleb softened his voice. "I'm already in it, ma'am." The diner filled. Forks clinked. People avoided his eyes, but they kept glancing back, a quiet hunger for courage. Caleb's mind ran options the way it always did. Exits, cover, angles. Beneath the planning lay grief. Liberty was out there, honeycoat dulled by fear and exhaust, amber eyes searching for him. He pictured her empathy like a hand reaching through dark. At 10 sharp, the door slammed open. Officer Hank Ryler entered with Sneed and Vance, laughter loud, belts already loosening for a feast they wouldn't pay for. Ryler's piggish eyes found Caleb at the window table, and the laughter died, as if someone cut its throat. He marched down the aisle, baton tapping his thigh. "You again," he growled. "You got a death wish, boy?" Caleb lifted his gaze, calm as frost. "I checked the reservation book," he said, loud enough for everyone. "No name on this table." A ripple ran through the room. Ryler's face flushed purple. "You don't get it," he hissed, leaning close. "This town is mine." Caleb's hand stayed flat on the table. "Then bring my dog." For one heartbeat, Ryler's eyes flickered, surprise, then pleasure. He straightened, smiling. "Oh, you mean the mutt you brought trouble with?" He jerked his chin toward the window. Outside, a dark van idled by the curb. The side door slid open just enough to show golden fur and a muzzle strap. Liberty's eyes met Caleb's through the crack. Amber, wet, still loyal. Her tail thumped once against metal. "I'm here." Caleb's chest tightened. He kept his face still. "Let her out!" Sneed grinned. He moved to the van door. Through the window, Caleb saw Sneed jab a boot inside. Liberty flinched, a soft whine muffled by the muzzle. The cruelty hit Caleb like a match to gasoline. Arthur stood up shaking, voice cracking but fierce. "Stop it! You don't kick a dog!" Vance shoved him with one huge arm. Arthur flew back into the booth. Air punched out of him. Mabel screamed, dropping a tray. The room froze on a knife edge. Caleb rose. He moved with controlled speed, not rage. 1 step, 2, and his left hand caught Ryler's wrist before the baton could lift. His right forearm drove into Ryler's elbow joint, using leverage, not brute strength. Ryler yelped as Caleb turned him and pinned him against the window in a lock that could break bone. Caleb didn't. He held, eyes cold, breathing steady, sealed discipline wrapped around a civilian room. "Easy," Caleb said, not to Ryler, but to himself. "Don't." Sneed and Vance drew their pistols. 2 black circles aimed at Caleb's head. People gasped, chairs scraping back. A child whimpered near the counter. Caleb read the room. Civilians everywhere, glass behind him, Liberty trapped outside. He could disarm one gunman, maybe both, but not without a stray round finding Mabel or Arthur. Winning the fight would lose the town. He released pressure and raised his hands. "I am complying," he announced, voice clear. He turned, interlaced fingers behind his head, and stepped away from Ryler. Ryler's grin returned, ugly with relief. "Cuff him!" he barked. Vance slammed Caleb into the window, ratcheting handcuffs tight around his wrists. Pain flashed up Caleb's injured arm, bright and nauseating, but he didn't make a sound. He watched the reflection in the glass, townspeople staring, fear mixing with something new, witness. Outside, the van door opened wider. Liberty barked once, muffled, urgent. Caleb met her eyes. He gave the smallest nod. "Hold on." Ryler leaned close, breath hot. "You wanted your dog? You'll see her after you learn respect." They dragged Caleb toward the door. As the bell jingled, Caleb saw Liberty hauled out by a man in an animal control shirt that didn't fit right. A shock collar dangled from his hand like a trophy. Liberty fought the leash with silent strength, then stilled when she spotted Caleb, choosing discipline over panic. The sun hit Caleb's face as they shoved him into the back of a cruiser, The door slammed. The smell inside was sweat and disinfectant. Through the barred window, he caught one last glimpse of Liberty's golden coat disappearing into the van. His phone buzzed again, trapped in his pocket, useless. Caleb closed his eyes and became the coil. Outside, sirens began to rise. Not for him, but for the town's lie. They faded behind the cruiser as it turned onto a service road, tires humming over asphalt. Caleb Cross sat upright in the back seat, wrists cuffed behind him, shoulders squared despite the sting in his wrapped forearm. The vinyl bench was damp with disinfectant and sweat. Every bump sent a hot pulse through his arm and up his jaw, where he held tension like a clenched blade. Through the cage window, he caught flashes of Oak Haven, churchgoers frozen on sidewalks, faces turned away. Caleb kept his gaze, not because he was calm, but because panic had a sound. It sounded like a door kicked in at midnight, like his own breath turning shallow. Liberty would hear it wherever they had taken her. Liberty always heard him. The cruiser rolled into the rear lot of the police station, a squat brick building that looked more like a warehouse than a place for help. Vance yanked the door open and hauled Caleb out by the elbow, fingers biting into muscle. Caleb's beard brushed the collar of his shirt as he steadied himself, scars along his knuckles pale against the handcuff steel. "Walk," Vance grunted. Caleb walked. He measured the steps, counted the turns, mapped the route the way he used to map compounds. Heavy steel doors swallowed them, cutting off daylight and replacing it with cold fluorescent glare. The smell hit first: bleach, stale coffee, damp paper. The same chemical bite that always tried to drag him back to a different room, a different war. He forced his tongue against the back of his teeth, grounding himself in the ache of his wrists. They bypassed booking, no names, no rights, no record. Sneed smirked as if shortcuts were sport. "Special guest," he whispered to a clerk, and the clerk looked down fast. A hallway of cinder block led to the last door. Vance shoved Caleb into a chair, bolted to a metal table, and looped the cuffs through a welded ring. The ratchet clicked, once, twice, too tight. Caleb did not give them a flinch to enjoy. The door slammed. Silence settled, broken only by a buzzing light that flickered like a faulty heartbeat. Caleb stared at the wall, breathing slow. His mind tried to fill the room with images. Liberty in the van, Liberty muzzled, Liberty shocked. He pushed those images aside and listened for what was real. From somewhere outside the room came a bark. One bark, then two, deep and urgent, not frantic. "Liberty." Her voice punched through concrete like a signal flare. Caleb's throat tightened. He closed his eyes for 1 second and let the sound anchor him, the way her warm coat used to anchor his hand when nightmares shook him awake. He remembered a voice from years ago. "A warrior waits. Let them tighten the net. Then you become the spring." Caleb opened his eyes. He was the spring. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Officer Hank Ryler stepped in, wrist wrapped, face flushed with bruised pride. Sneed followed, leaning on the frame like a vulture guarding a carcass. Ryler did not sit. He paced, baton hanging at his side, boots loud on concrete. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Ryler spat. "You think you can humiliate me in my own diner and walk away?" Caleb kept his gaze level. "Where is my dog?" Ryler's smile spread slow and cruel. "Safe," he said, savoring the lie. "Safer than you're about to be." Sneed chuckled. "She whines a lot for a trained animal." Caleb's fingers flexed once against the cuffs. He felt Liberty's golden head against his thigh in memory, felt the softness of her ears, the way her amber eyes never judged him when his hands shook. He forced his voice steady. "If she is hurt, you'll answer for it." Ryler leaned forward until his breath warmed Caleb's face. "Answer to who?" he whispered. "The town that watched you get cuffed like a stray?" Caleb said nothing. Silence irritated bullies more than resistance. Ryler straightened and turned his head toward the corner ceiling. A small security camera blinked red. He reached up and slapped his cap over it. Then he flipped a wall switch. The red light died. "Off the record," Ryler said softly. Sneed pushed the door shut and planted himself in front of it, arms crossed. Ryler snapped his baton open with a metallic hiss. He tested it against his palm. Tap, tap, tap. "I'm going to break the hand you used on me," he said. "Then we're going outside, and I'm going to show you what we do to nuisance dogs." A thin sound came through the wall, a muffled whimper. Liberty. Not her usual calm huff, but pain. Caleb's chest tightened so hard it felt like armor pressing inward. Ryler lifted the baton. "Before you swing," Caleb said. Ryler paused, amused. "Got a prayer?" Caleb met his eyes, cold and clear. "You already made your mistake." Sneed scoffed. "What mistake?" Caleb nodded toward the dead camera. "Turning that off doesn't change what's been recorded." He kept his tone clinical. "My dog's harness carries an encrypted camera and a cellular uplink. It recorded you extorting cash, taking bribes, kicking her, shoving that old veteran. It recorded you ordering my arrest. It is evidence." Ryler's grin wavered. "You're lying." Caleb shook his head once. "And there is a dead man's switch. If I do not check in within 10 minutes, a packet goes out with my location and the files. Federal eyes, they don't need your judge." Sneed's posture shifted, uncertainty sliding under his swagger. "Boss?" Ryler's face went pale, then red again. "Show me your phone," he snapped. Caleb's phone was in his front pocket, just out of reach, with cuffed hands. "You didn't search me," he said. Ryler swore and grabbed Caleb's pant leg, fishing the phone free. He held it up like a trophy. The screen was dark, locked. He shook it, then slammed it on the table. "Unlock it." "I can't," Caleb said evenly. "Not with cuffs." Ryler looked at Sneed. Sneed produced a small device from his pocket, a signal jammer. He clicked it on. A faint electronic whine filled the room. Ryler's eyes gleamed with relief. "There. Now your little trick can't call anyone." Caleb watched the jammer, then Ryler's baton. "You're not as smart as you think," he said. Ryler snarled and raised the baton again. 10 minutes, ma. Let's see how many bones I can crack before then." Outside the room, Liberty barked once, sharp and pleading, then fell silent as if someone had pressed a hand over her muzzle. Caleb's pulse surged, then steadied. He stared at Ryler's sweating grip. In his mind, the timer kept ticking. Caleb pictured Liberty's honey coat pressed against cold wire, her amber eyes searching the doorway every time Boots approached. He forced himself to inhale through his nose, taste the bleach, and name the present. Table, cuffs, light, breath. The pain in his forearm was real. The fear was optional, right now only. 3 minutes. 2. Ryler swung the baton down toward Caleb's left hand. Caleb jerked his fingers back at the last heartbeat. The baton cracked against the cuff chain instead of bone, sending a jolt up his wrapped forearm. He used it. While Ryler reset, Caleb slid his cuffed wrists under the table edge and looped the chain around the chair's bolted bracket. He drove his weight backward. Metal groaned. "Hold him!" Sneed shouted, jammer whining as he stepped in. Ryler swung again. Caleb ducked and let the baton smash the bracket a second time. The chair tore free with a screech, ripping the ring from the table. Caleb surged up with the chair frame still tangled at his wrists and slammed it into Ryler's ribs. Ryler folded. Caleb pivoted and drove the chair into Sneed's chest, pinning him to the doorframe. The jammer popped loose and clattered away. From the kennels, Liberty barked, one hard note, then another, like she was counting for him. Caleb kicked the jammer until it split. He ripped the chair away, grabbed Ryler's drop baton, and hooked it under the cuff chain. A twist, a snap. One cuff sprang open. He peeled the other off and forced a slow breath. The fluorescent buzz tried to become rotor blades in his skull, but Liberty's voice yanked him back. Present, now. Sneed lunged. Caleb chopped his wrist, snatched the keyring, and shoved him down. Ryler pushed up, face purple with humiliation. Caleb set the baton on the table like a boundary. "Stay," he said. Then he moved. The hallway was empty. No booking, no witnesses. Caleb ran low and quiet, beard, scar at his temple bright under the lights. He followed Liberty's bark into the K9 run, chain-link pens, concrete wet with hose water. Liberty stood in the far kennel, honey coat, amber eyes locked on him. A thick shock collar rode high on her neck, wire leading to a gray control box on the wall. "Hey girl," Caleb whispered, "I'm here." A man in an animal control shirt stepped from the shadows. Too clean shirt, two tactical boots. Pistol low, remote in hand, thumb poised. "Mayor says you both disappear," he said. Liberty trembled but held position, waiting on Caleb. Caleb raised empty hands and drifted sideways, placing his body between the man and the dog. "Easy," he murmured. more for Liberty than him. Then the baton left Caleb's hand in a tight arc and struck the man's wrist. The remote flew. Caleb closed the distance, drove an elbow into the man's jaw, and caught the remote as it bounced. Liberty flinched when the collar clicked, but Caleb slapped the power off and tore the collar away. "It's okay," he said, palm pressed to her neck. Her heartbeat hammered, then slowed. Liberty leaned into him, eyes wet, and Caleb's hands finally stopped shaking. A siren wailed out front. Doors slammed. Shouts spilled down the halls. "Out!" Caleb said. They burst through a side exit into the rear lot. Blue lights flashed near the main entrance. A black SUV skidded sideways to block the gate, and men poured out wearing helmets and vests marked Task Force in tape that looked too fresh. Their patches didn't match any agency Caleb knew, hired muscle. Caleb clipped Liberty's working harness on, no camera now, just the handle, and pulled her close. "Stay tight." They cut behind dumpsters and slipped through a maintenance gate into a drainage corridor under Main Street. Damp air, sour water. Caleb's forearm burned with each push along the wall. Liberty padded beside him, silent and careful, nudging his thigh whenever his breathing hitched, as if she could feel the war trying to climb up his spine. Boots thundered above. A voice barked, "Seal the alleys! He's got the dog!" Caleb found a rusted ladder and dropped into a larger storm tunnel. Darkness pressed close. For a blink, the tunnel tried to become another tunnel, dirt, screaming, green light. Caleb's chest cinched. Liberty nudged him again, firm. He named the smell, sewer, not smoke. That water, not blood. He followed her steady pace. They surfaced 3 blocks away through a culvert hidden by weeds behind a strip mall. A delivery van idled at a loading dock, driver smoking and staring at his phone. Step away from the van," Caleb called, calm and loud. The driver saw the cuff bruises on Caleb's wrists, saw Liberty's vest, and chose not to argue. He backed off. Caleb tossed his wallet onto the dock. "Call it a rental," he said, then climbed in. Liberty leapt into the passenger seat, ears forward, scanning. They took back roads until the sirens thinned. Blood seeped through Caleb's gauze. Liberty pressed her nose to his bandage like a reminder not to bleed out from pride. "Okay," Caleb rasped. "Stitches." Oak Haven Medical was small brick and bright. A nurse in her late 50s looked up, gray-streaked hair, steady eyes, the posture of someone brave without applause. Badge. Donna. She took one look at Caleb's scarred face, then at Liberty's raw collar line, and her mouth tightened. "They did this," Donna said. Caleb nodded. "I can't stay." "Then don't," Donna replied, already gloving. She ushered him into an exam room without asking a name. Her hands were sure as she cleaned and stitched his forearm. Liberty rested her head on Caleb's knee, amber eyes following Donna's movements. "You're bleeding like a man who keeps running," Donna murmured. "If I stop," Caleb said softly, "I go back." Donna taped the dressing and listened to the hallway. "They'll come," she said. "This town doesn't let people leave." The overhead lights flickered. The intercom crackled, then a voice boomed. "Lock down! All staff remain in place." The voice was wrong, too crisp, too male. Donna went pale. "That isn't ours." Boots hit the corridor. Shouts. A crash of metal. Through the narrow door window, Caleb saw black helmets moving in a stack, rifles up. Fake SWAT. Donna shoved a keycard into his palm. "Service hall," she whispered. "Laundry chute, roof access, helipad." The door handle began to turn. Caleb yanked Donna behind the exam bed and mouthed, "Go." He palmed the keycard, cracked the supply door, and slipped them into the service hall as the room door swung wide. A helmeted man scanned the room, saw only rumpled sheets, and swore. Donna pointed to the narrow laundry chute. Caleb lowered Liberty first, then dropped after her, landing hard in lint in the linen room below. They ran between rolling carts until a second stack poured in from the loading dock. A gloved hand snagged Liberty's harness handle and yanked her toward a kennel cage on wheels. Before Caleb could grab her, a shock collar snapped on and the man thumbed a switch. Liberty stiffened, a strangled sound, but she did not bite. Caleb spotted a small jammer on the man's vest, ripped it free, and slammed it into the wall switch panel. The lights died. In the dark, Liberty's teeth found the zip tie on the latch and tore it. She lunged back to Caleb's side. Caleb hauled Liberty toward the stairwell, keycard biting his palm. Up top, rotors hammered. When the roof door burst open, a spotlight pinned them, and a voice said, "Drop the dog." Drop the dog? The command came through rotor wash and a blinding roof spotlight that turned the night into a white wound. Caleb Cross froze at the doorway, Liberty tucked tight to his left leg, her honey coat rippling under the wind, like a flag that refused to fall. He lifted his hands slowly, palms open, beard dripping sweat, scar at his temple shining, as if the light had found every hard mile he'd ever walked. Two men in black helmets stood between him and the painted circle of the helipad. Their vests said Task Force, but their boots were wrong, too new, too tactical for local budgets. One carried a carbine with a suppressor, the other held a shock remote like a set of keys. Behind them, a helicopter idled, blades chopping, door open, ready to swallow secrets. Caleb's mind tried to split into two timelines, the roof and the desert, the spotlight and the flare, Liberty's breath and a teammate's last gasp. He forced himself to name the present. Cold steel door, wet concrete, Liberty's shoulder touching his knee. He felt her tremble, then settle, choosing him. "Step forward," the gunman barked. Caleb stepped, just enough to clear the doorway, then stopped again. The gunman shifted his aim a hair. Caleb watched the movement, cataloged it, and spoke in the calm tone that made bullies lean in. "You're not police," he said. The remote man snorted. "Doesn't matter what we are." "It does," Caleb replied, the eyes flat. "Because real police don't need to hide their faces to do their jobs." A flash of anger crossed the gunman's posture. He took one step closer. That step was the mistake. Caleb's right hand flicked a keycard, Donna's keycard, like a coin. The gunman's eyes tracked it instinctively. Liberty surged. She didn't bite. She hit the man's shin with her shoulder, a hard, trained impact that knocked his balance sideways in the rotor wind. Caleb drove in behind her, using the stumble to hook the carbine's barrel and shove it up and out. The weapon fired once, an ugly crack swallowed by the helicopter's roar, sending a round into the sky. Everyone on the roof flinched except Caleb. He seized the moment like oxygen. He grabbed Liberty's harness handle and ran. They sprinted across the helipad's slick paint, then dropped low behind a ventilation unit as the second man cursed and thumbed the remote. Liberty yelped, body stiffening, then nothing. The collar wasn't on her. Caleb had torn it off in the kennels. The remote man stared at his useless device, confused, and fear finally crawled into his voice. "Get them!" he shouted. Boots pounded, muzzle flashes stitched the roof edge, bright and brief. Caleb pressed his cheek to Liberty's head, speaking into her ear like a prayer. "Stay with me. Stay." She answered with a warm huff, eyes shining, trusting. That trust kept him from doing something reckless. He wasn't here to win a firefight. He was here to survive long enough for truth to arrive. Below the helicopter's engine whine, a new sound grew, deep, heavy, official. Sirens, not Oak Haven's lazy wail. These were layered, disciplined, coming fast. The gunman nearest the stairwell hesitated, head tilting as if listening. Then the rooftop access door exploded inward, and the night changed. A line of troopers poured out in gray campaign hats, weapons up, voices sharp and controlled. "State Patrol! Down! Down now!" Behind them moved agents in dark jackets, FBI letters, a small NCIS patch on one shoulder. Floodlights from the lot swung up, pinning the fake team in clean, undeniable illumination. Captain Marcus Harris stepped onto the roof like judgment wearing a uniform. He was tall, granite-faced, with eyes that didn't blink at threats. "Hands where I can see them!" he roared. The masked gunmen turned their weapons too late. Troopers surged fast and practiced. A rifle was yanked away, a shoulder slammed to concrete, plastic ties cinched. The remote man tried to run for the helicopter door. An MP tackled him at the threshold, driving him down hard. The pilot threw his hands up, shouting he'd been hired. He didn't know. No one listened. Caleb stayed behind the ventilation unit until Harris's gaze found him. For a beat, the captain's eyes softened. Not much, just enough to say, "You held." "Sir," Caleb called, voice rough. "My dog?" Harris lifted a hand. "We see her. You're safe now." Safe. The word hit Caleb like a foreign language. His knees threatened to buckle. Liberty stepped forward first, tail low but wagging, and touched her nose to Harris's boot, like she was testing whether this authority was real. Harris crouched, careful, and offered his knuckles. Liberty sniffed, then leaned in, accepting. An FBI agent approached Caleb with a tablet in hand. "Caleb Cross?" he asked. Caleb nodded once. "Retired. Active reserve paperwork was in my truck." "We know," the agent said. "We also know your dead man switch finally pinged." Caleb's stomach dropped. "How?" "Your jammer got smashed," the agent replied, glancing toward the zip tie litter and broken electronics. "Signal came through, files hit our server, and your micro SD." Caleb's head snapped down, Liberty's collar, his stitches, his insurance. A woman in a dark suit stepped onto the roof, hair silver, posture severe, eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't need an introduction, she carried one. "Mr. Cross," she said, voice smooth with steel, "I'm Judge Eleanor Sterling, and Oak Haven is finished." Downstairs, chaos unfolded like the end of a long, rotten play. Ryler was dragged from the station in cuffs, shouting that his father would fix it. Sneed sobbed. Vance stared blankly at the ground. The mayor, Big Jim Ryler, was escorted from his office under a search warrant, still wearing his church tie, face pale as paper. By dawn, rain had washed the streets clean. The diner bell jingled again, but this time nobody flinched. Caleb walked in with Liberty at heel, her coat brushed, her eyes brighter. Mabel saw them and pressed both hands to her mouth. Arthur stood trembling and lifted a salute with a shaky dignity that made Caleb's throat tighten. Caleb returned it, slow and precise, then knelt to let Liberty rest her head on his shoulder. "You gave us our town back," Mabel whispered. Caleb looked around at the ordinary faces, the coffee cups, the sunrise in the window. "No," he said softly. "You did. I just reminded you you're allowed to." Donna came by the afternoon, checking his stitches with the same steady hands she'd used in the exam room. She didn't ask for thanks. She simply set a jar of ointment on the table and scratched Liberty's ears. "Keep doing the right thing," she said, and walked out into the air. Later, when the engines and paperwork moved on, Caleb stayed. Not forever. He still had shadows, but long enough to rent a small building near the courthouse and hang a simple sign: K9 Recovery and Veterans Table. He taught breathing to men who couldn't sleep. He trained dogs to anchor shaking hands, and every morning Liberty lay under the front desk, amber eyes watching the door, making sure no one faced the dark alone again.